Strange Studies of Strange Stories.
My first experience was far more of a test than anything that has ever happened to me since in that line. Not more agreeable, but certainly more testing. I have noticed several times that it is to beginners that strange things happen, and often I think to beginners only. When you know about a thing, there's just nothing to it. This kind of thing included. Anyway, in most cases. After the first 6 women, say, or 7, or 8, the rest come much of a muchness.
My goodness, are we finally covering James Bond on this podcast?
No, sir. This month is April. Aickman April. Back by popular demand, we are spending all of April covering stories from the author Robert Aickman.
The fact that Robert Aickman writes about sex even a little bit makes him the James Bond of this podcast.
And he is certainly writing about sex in this story called The Swords.
Aickman is most often classified as a horror author, but he preferred to call his creations strange stories, which puts him right at home on this podcast. Folks, welcome to Strange Studies of Strange Stories. I'm Chad Pfeiffer.
And I'm Chris Lackey. This is our free show for April. Please subscribe to follow along as we read classic genre stories every week.
You know, it wasn't just the casual enumerating of sexual partners in that opening reading that made me think we had James Bond on the show. It was also the suave voice of that reader.
And that reader is the amazing Greg Johnson. Greg makes videos about making things. Those things include props, costumes, other videos, and miniatures. Go check them out on YouTube, and if you like what you see, Greg is on Patreon just like us.
I read a bunch of Aickman over the holidays, but I only recently got around to this one. However, I do remember that you read it really early on when we were first learning about this guy, and you told me it was pretty disturbing.
Yeah, I got this story, The Swords, in the collection Cold Hand and Mine. It's the first story in that collection. But I didn't read it with my eyes first. I read it with my ears. The audiobooks are read by Reese Shearsmith of League of Gentlemen and Inside Number 9 fame. Rachel and I were on a gloomy road trip. The kids were in the back with headphones on. And I said, hey, I want to listen to this story. You want to give it a go? And she's like, yeah, sure. We were totally enthralled. It was really neat to have that shared experience of listening to a story together, which is something I'd have never did before or really since. Of course, I have now read it, and it was a great experience both ways.
I was expecting there'd be a twist to your story where at the end of it, you'd realize the kids' headphones weren't on. You turn around and they just both have these shocked expressions on their face because you just made them listen to Swords.
The Swords was first published in the 5th Fontana Book of Great Ghost Stories from 1969.
Aickman edited the first 8 volumes of those ghost story collections, so he put his own story in there, rightly so.
Yeah, this story is a bit longer, and I have a lot I want to talk about, so let's just get right into it. It starts with a quote from Federico Lorca's poem, Casita de la Rosa, from 1931, which translates to, Heart Wounded by 5 Swords.
Maybe that epigraph was a jumping off point for him. It is in Spanish and not translated at the top of the story, so I kind of ignored it. Because that's not uncommon to have a foreign language quote at the top of a story, although I've never really understood it. Like Poe will put a French quote at the top of a story, or maybe it'll be something in Latin. And the end result is usually that it just makes me feel uneducated. You know, it's a little like going to a fancy restaurant. It makes me feel like I don't really belong here.
Yeah.
I'm still going to eat the food, though.
Maybe the author's just trying to put you in your place. Before you
I
get
think
into
most
the story.
of them are. That's usually my attitude when I go into a story. What are they trying to prove? But that epigraph is followed by the opening paragraphs that we just heard Greg read. And they introduce this story as part of a conversation. The first line is a question. My first experience? Oh, my first experience is far more of a test than anything that has ever happened since. And this introduces an immediate intimacy with the reader. It's implied that you're the one that asked him to talk about this. Maybe you've just related an experience of your own, or at the very least, this is you listening in to one side of a very candid conversation. And the conversation is about sex, but references first experiences as a general thing. It is to beginners that strange things happen, and often I think to beginners only, which is definitely true with sex, but with anything, really. Obviously, the first few times you do something, first few days of a new job, those are the times you remember because everything's strange and weird.
Right.
But I think it also maybe suggests that as you get used to things, strange things continue to happen, but in routine, our eyes are closed to them.
He says, I was a beginner, all right, raw as a spring onion. What's more, I was a real mother's boy, scared stiff of life and crass ignorant. This beginner is our unnamed narrator, a young man whose father died recently in an accident. His mother got him a job with her brother, Uncle Elias, who is a grocery salesman, and he wants the narrator to get out and live life by getting on the road, making deals to retailers and growers alike. His uncle sometimes sends him out on the road with the sad sack Bantock. When they travel, Elias picks the places that they stay, which are sometimes hotels, but other times shady places where sex work and other sketchy businesses going down.
Yeah.
And it's pretty clear that Uncle Elias has an ongoing relationship with some of these women at the places that he has them stay.
Right.
And also Bantock's wife, which is cold as ice.
Yeah, Uncle Elias is giving it to Mrs. Bantock.
Yes, so he sends him out for work, and while he's on the road trips, he's having sex with his wife. Damn.
That's the definition of cold as ice. This narrator's mother doesn't really want him to do this job because she knows he's about to get a crash course in immorality, as she sees it. But there's nothing to be done because of his father's death. He needs to work. And in these seedier places he's staying, which obviously his uncle's getting them on the cheap since he's got relationships with these women, he's hearing and seeing things that are blowing his mind. It says noises all night so that it was impossible to sleep properly, and often half-dressed tarts beating on your door and screaming that they've been swindled or strangled. Some of the travelers even brought in boys. And there I was in the middle of it, pure and unspotted. So he's learning a few things about the adult world, capital A. And after 4 or 5 months on the job, the narrator winds up by himself in Wolverhampton, staying at one of these seedy lodgings. He says there was absolutely nothing to do, nowhere even to sit and watch the telly. All you could think of was to go out and get drunk or bring someone in with you from the pictures. Neither idea appealed very much to me, and I found myself just wandering about the town. Now, during his wanderings, the narrator does come across a small fair. It's on a small plot where the houses are demolished or falling apart, kind of a rundown, empty lot. The carnival itself is hastily set up, and it's probably going to be gone the next day, he thinks. Maybe doesn't even have a permit to be there. And that reminded me of small carnivals that would pop up in the summers when we were younger.
Sure, yeah.
Little slipshod, maybe dangerous.
Yep.
And when I was a teenager, especially, you went there to meet girls, for sure. Was, you wander up and down the boardwalk hoping you'd meet a corresponding number of pretty girls to your group. At this fair, there's not a lot of that. There's a few kids around playing games, but it's fairly empty, fairly sad. There is a ticket taker for an empty ride in the center of the whole thing. And this is a very beautiful girl who seems to be staring at the narrator, even contemptuously maybe, because he's not coming up and buying a ticket or he's not sure why. But just having a woman look at him or a girl look at him makes him extremely self-conscious. So that's where we're finding the guy. And he thinks, well, I can't just run out of the fair or I'll look stupid. So, hey, what's this over here? He finds this tent. It says in more or less the farthest corner where the high factory walls made an angle. It was a square tent of very dirty red and white striped canvas, and over the crumpled entrance flap was a rough-edged, dark-painted horizontal board with written on it in faint gold capital letters, "The Swords." That was all there was.
Curiosity causes the narrator to touch the flap, but he doesn't actually have the nerve to peek inside to see what's going on. But that touch was enough for this young guy to pop out. He's caked in dirt, and he asks for 2 pop, which is 2 shillings. The narrator says he doesn't want to pay, but he's afraid that he's going to look foolish, so he decides to just give the guy the money and then go in. Now, the tent's dark. It's lit only with a Tilly lamp and a bunch of mismatched chairs and 7 men just sitting around quietly. And the fact that the chairs are mismatched, for some reason, that really rang true to me.
Absolutely right.
It's one of those details that that gives it that little extra bit of reality that I love in Aickman stories.
And the Tilly lamp is just, I had to look it up. That's just sort of like a hanging lantern. So just enough light to make out the basics that there are these 7 men sitting there. All of them were in single units and all were men. I think I was the youngest among them by quite a long way. And the show was something I've never seen or heard of since. Not even read of. Not exactly. This situation right here does remind me of a different kind of theater that people would go to back in the day, which is the adult movie theater. All of these men sitting alone together. I was thinking about how this, especially in Aickman's day, but even when we were kids, this was a rite of passage for men that's maybe gone now. I don't know whether that's a good or bad thing. Probably good.
Yeah.
But pornography is consumed now at home. It's consumed pretty anonymously. But, when we were young lads, that was not the case.
Nope.
I never went to an adult theater myself, to be honest, but they were still around. There was one right downtown in our small hometown.
Yep.
It was called the Pleasure Palace. And it was a little more like this tent instead of a palace. It was like a small, seedy storefront. But most guys, maybe as part of a bachelor party even, will have gone to at least an adult video store or a sparsely populated strip club. It's an experience where you're in a social group, but you don't want to associate with the other people who are there. You know, if I'm in a comic book store perusing something, somebody wanders by and says, oh, that run of Daredevil is really great. Like, that's a good thing.
Yeah.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah.
But if you're at the adult video store, you don't want the interaction. It's everybody acting like they don't know each other.
Right. But I don't know. It might depend on the individual as well, because...
Well, right, if you go enough.
Yeah. Well, some people do go there to meet other people.
Right.
Especially the adult movie theaters. Gay men would often go there to meet other men because there wasn't really a safe place to find other guys. If the place wasn't big enough to have a gay bar, I might have an adult movie theater, and then they would be able to go to the adult movie theater and somehow communicate to each other that they were gay and interested in each
there
other.
was an incredibly complex series of communications that would go on, hand signals and how you would stand. And I think part of that atmosphere was charged with that if you make eye contact with the wrong person or you send the wrong signal, what's going to happen next? And so it creates this incredibly tense social situation of consuming adult material. And, you know, when this story was written, I think a lot of men would have gone through that. You also have a society where they might have had a parent that said, hey, you need to lose your virginity. I'm going to take you to the whorehouse. So there were like even more extreme versions of that. Yeah. Where people would suddenly be plunged into an adult world and a range of dehumanizing things all happen at the same time. Yeah. So back to the story. In the tent, the men are all facing this makeshift stage, this platform where a showman is talking. He's this burly guy in a tattered sweater that kind of makes him look like a seaman. And to his left, there's a girl sprawled out on an upright canvas chair wearing a tight, shiny, low-cut dress and black fishnet stockings with heels. He says the total effect was not particularly sexy all the same. The girl's makeup is this green powder, and her hair is done up tight like a ballet dancer's. And next to her on a low square stool is this heaping pile of swords stacked crisscross. Fairly cheap, but they're real swords.
The narrator doesn't know how long the show's been going on, but the showman is asking for a volunteer, encouraging the men to stop being shy. One guy in the audience tries to be sassy with him, but the showman says, all right, you come up then. And then that guy gets really nervous and doesn't want to do it, but then somebody else volunteers. The showman tells him to pick up a sword. Go on, he says, stick it in.
And then it happened, this extraordinary thing.
The volunteer seemed to me to tremble for a moment, and then plunged the sword right into the girl on the chair. As he was standing between me and her, I could not see where the sword entered, but I could see that the man seemed to press it right in, because almost the whole length of it seemed to disappear. What I could have no doubt about at all was the noise the sword made. A curious thing was that we are so used to at least the idea of people being stuck through with swords, that even though naturally I had never before seen anything of the kind, I had no doubt at all of what the man had done. The noise of the sword tearing through the flesh was only what I should have expected, but it was quite distinct, even above the hissing of the tilly, and quite long drawn out too, and horrible. I could sense the other men in the audience gathering themselves together on the instant and suddenly coming to life. I could still see little of what precisely had happened. "Pull it out," said the seaman, quite casually, but as if speaking to a moron. He was still only half turned towards the volunteer and still looking straight in front of him. He was not looking at anything, just holding himself in control while getting through a familiar routine. The volunteer pulled out the sword. I could again hear that unmistakable sound. The volunteer still stood facing the girl, but with the tip of the sword resting on the platform. I could see no blood. Of course, I thought I had made some complete misinterpretation, been fooled like a kid. Obviously, it was some kind of conjuring.
After this is done, the seaman tells the customer, okay, you can kiss the girl now. It's included with what you've paid. And the man did, even though I could only see his back. With the sword drooping from his hand, he leaned forwards and downwards. I think it was a slow and loving kiss, not a smacking and public kiss, because this time I could hear nothing. After this first interaction, he gets a look at the girl who sits up, holding her left side where she was presumably stabbed, but there's no blood at all.
Yeah.
And not only that, she looks happy about what happened.
It's also weird. The narrator assumes that this is some kind of stage trick, but it doesn't quite make sense. The swords seem solid, the sounds are too real, and the whole thing is really sexual. And one by one, the other men take turns, but stabbing her in different parts of her body. The men all seem to know these rules, these unspoken rules, and they follow them. They come up, they stab the girl, they kiss her, and then they sit down. The girl reacts with pleasure as if she's enjoying this process.
I feel like sometimes Aickman looks at something we take for granted and then explicates it in such a way to make it weird again. We definitely are going to find that next week when we cover the Cicerones. But here, we do go to magic shows where women are pierced by 7 or 8 swords or sawed in half.
Right.
Well, as he watches her brighten up being pierced by these swords, he sort of falls in love with this woman.
Yeah.
It says, I could not even tell what color her eyes were, but the fact of the matter is that they turned my heart right over. I was so simple and inexperienced that nothing like that had ever happened to me before in my whole life. The incredible green powder made no difference. Nothing that had just been happening made any difference. I wanted that girl more than anything I'd ever wanted. And I don't mean I just wanted her body. That comes later in life. I wanted to love her and tussle with her and all the other better things we want before the time comes when we know that however much we want them, we're not going to get them. So he's feeling that absolutely crushing puppy love.
Finally, the narrator is overwhelmed by all this, and he runs out of there and back to his scuzzy lodgings.
The next day, however, he can't get this experience off of his mind, and he returns to the fairground. But it's closed up. He sneaks in to have a peek in the tent, and there's this dwarf-like watchman there. There's a whole scene with him, but he essentially runs him off of the property. You know, that reminded me of the way that he seems like he's traumatized by the whole experience, but then is right back there the next day to see if he can get more information. Kind of reminded me of my advertising days. One of the things that I would have to do is we'd take clients out. It was not uncommon that they wanted to go to a strip club after dinner.
Right.
They'd have some drinks and they wanted to go somewhere. So one client we had taken to Fantasy Island, which was a sort of a go-go bar, if you remember, on Pico.
I know that place.
There's a big gang of us, maybe 8 people. We went, had drinks, watched a little of the show, and then at a reasonable time we left because we knew that these were our clients and they might go crazy, but we had to have some decorum because we were going to have a meeting with them the next day, you know. So we leave. But what had happened is that somebody from our team and one of the clients waited 5 minutes and then went back, you know? Because they were all geared up and wanted to not be with other people when they went. But 2 people did that from the same group. So when they both came in, they saw each other. Fully knowing they had both just tried to pull the same trick and then had to spend like an uncomfortable drink together, you know, before they got out of there. Oh, yeah, I thought I needed to come back here. I left my card at the bar, you know. So funny to me. Anyway. He can't go to the fairground and find anybody, so he's just got to get on with his work day.
So the narrator goes back to work, makes his calls, keeps himself busy all day. At dinner time, he stops at a nearly empty cafe. Inside is the seaman/showman, and he sits with the green sword girl at a table. And this guy recognizes the narrator and invites him to sit down. The narrator doesn't really want to, but he just does because he seems like he's a bit wishy-washy and easily swayed in the story, this character. The seaman is totally laid back, and the woman, who is called Madonna, is kind of flirty with the narrator. He invites the narrator back to the show that night. It's going to be on again, but the narrator makes some excuses. The seaman suggests that the narrator have a private show at his lodgings later that night after the live show. He tells the narrator that the private shows are usually £20, sometimes 50, but for him, he'll do it for 10, which is about £250 on today's money.
Obviously, that's a lot of money for this character, too.
Yes.
He's a little shocked by it. But the guy says to him, Madonna has been trained to do anything else you want, anything you may happen to think of. He's saying you don't have to do what you saw on the show. You can do anything.
Yeah. You can have sex with her, is
you
what
can
he's
have
saying.
sex with her, basically, yeah.
Strangely, the narrator accepts this offer. Because it's strange to me because the way he tells this story is so emotionally detached that it almost feels like a surprise that he's just totally down to clown with this girl.
Yeah.
I mean, he's very attracted and he has this crush, but he seems so wishy-washy that I wouldn't think he would do something like that, but he is, and he's attracted to this woman, and I guess that he's young, and that this seaman guy, he's a pretty good salesman.
First of all, the fact that he runs across them in a restaurant, he ran out of the tent. He's a mark.
Right.
They recognized in him a level of nervousness that means they can extort more money from him, which is the reason that they came across his path. They've been following him, I think. When it seems that he's reticent when the offer's made, the guy says, well, look, we're only making this deal for you because you sat in this certain chair, and people who sit there, they have an elevated intellect, we've found. They flatter him.
Yeah.
They set him apart. So now it seems like, oh, she wants to be with me because I'm great.
Yeah.
They sort of turn it into that. And the name, he introduces that the name of the girl is Madonna in that sentence, that she's been trained to do anything you want. And I thought that was so curious because you've heard of the Madonna whore complex.
I have, yeah.
Which is Sigmund Freud came up with this. It's a thing in psychoanalysis, also called psychic impotence. It's a psychological complex that is said to develop in men who see women as either saintly Madonnas or debased whores. Men with this complex desire a sexual partner who has been degraded, while they cannot desire the respected partner. Freud wrote, where such men love, they have no desire, and where they desire, they cannot love. So it was ironic that her name is Madonna.
Yeah.
The narrator has agreed to the visit, but he doesn't have those 10 pounds. He's in love, so he probably would steal the money if he had to, but luckily, one of the shop owners he visits for work, Mr. Edis, turns out to be a little creepy.
Yep.
During conversation while he's making the sales call, the narrator mentions he's got a date that night, and the guy's like, oh? He says, do you have enough so that you can cuddle her as you want? The narrator admits, no, I don't. And so the man gives him a 5 right then and there on the condition that you come back the next night and tell him all about it. Concluding with this gem, good boy, get what you're paying for out of her and think of me while you're doing it. Though I don't expect you will. Ugh. But you think he's giving him money like, hey, you need some money for a date. But he already has it in his mind that it's transactional. Get what you're paying for out of her.
He might even suspect, since he's a traveling salesman, it might be a prostitute.
Right.
I think. That night, right on time, Madonna arrives outside. The narrator has been waiting in the rain, pacing up and down the street. She's completely soaked. She's got no umbrella, coat, or hat. And he takes her to his room, managing to avoid anybody else in the place that he's staying seeing her. When removing her outer clothes, he can see that she's wearing her clothes from the show. The black low-cut dress, the fishnets, and the heels. She seems less attractive than before, and she's very passive. She asks how he would like to start, and he just pulls her into his arms. Now, normally, this would be a super sexy thing, he thinks, but it feels all wrong.
I wasn't exactly accustomed to the feel of a half-naked woman, and I myself was still more or less fully dressed, but all the same, I thought at once that the feel of her was disappointing. It came as a bit of a shock. Quite a bad one, in fact. As often, when facts replace fancies, suddenly it had all become rather like a nightmare. That's so interesting that having a fantasy like that kind of ruined turns it into a nightmare. I felt like this whole story had the logic and pacing of a nightmare.
Sure, yeah.
The way that she's stabbed and nothing happens about it, all of that seemed very nightmarish to me. So he decides to advance things and tells her to get undressed, get into bed. He gets undressed as well, and here is going to be that first experience that the story has been leading up to, except that it's not how he thought it would be. She's so placid, agreeable, just sort of lying there. Finally, while he's over her, he throws back the bedclothes and he grabs her by the wrist with 2 hands, intending to pull her roughly up into an embrace so that he can kiss her on the neck and try to make some kind of passion out of the situation.
But what actually happened was very terrible indeed. So simple and so terrible that people won't always believe me. I gave this great, bad-tempered, disappointed pull at Madonna. She came up towards me and then fell back again with a sort of wail. I was still holding on to her hand and wrist with my 2 hands, and it took me quite some time to realize what had happened. What had happened was that I had pulled her left hand and wrist right off. On the instant, she twisted out of the bed and began to wriggle back into her clothes. I was aware that even in the almost non-existent light, she was somehow managing to move very swiftly. I had a frightful sensation of her beating round in my room with only one hand and wondered in terror how she could possibly manage. All the time, she was weeping to herself, or wailing might be the word. The noise she made was very soft, so soft that but for what was happening, I might have thought it was inside my own head. I got my feet onto the floor with the notion of turning on the light. The only switch was, of course, by the door. I had the idea that with some light on the scene, there might be certain explanations. but I found that I couldn't get to the switch. In the first place, I couldn't bear the thought of touching Madonna, even accidentally. In the second place, I discovered that my legs would go no farther. I was too utterly scared to move at all. Scared, repelled, and that mixed up something else connected with disappointed sex for which there is no exact word. So I just sat there, on the edge of the bed, while Madonna got back into her things, crying all the while, in that awful, heartbreaking way, which I shall never forget. Not that it went on for long. As I've said, Madonna was amazingly quick. I couldn't think of anything to say or do, especially with so little time for it. When she had put on her clothes, she made a single, appallingly significant snatch in my direction, caught something up, almost as if she, at least, could see in the dark. Then she had unlocked the door and bolted.
Aickman, man, he can't even say, she grabbed the hand out of my hand. He's got to say she caught something up.
Yeah.
You know?
Right.
From a literary standpoint, I think this is a clear comment on the perception of women by men as doll-like disposable things, almost like mannequins. Aickman's really into the hand imagery. This is the one anthology of his I have that isn't from that Faber and Faber collection. It's the first print of it in America in the 70s, and it's got an Edward Gorey illustration on the cover, which is just a giant hand in front of a manor house. And of course, the title, Cold Hand in Mine.
Right.
But the hand coming off, she could really have just had a prosthetic hand.
Yeah, there's an element to the story where all of this stuff could be reasonably explained. It's his perception of things that makes it feel unreal and strange.
Or you could go off in a science fiction direction and she's some kind of, maybe not a robot, but some kind of creation, some kind of automaton. The fact that she was in the green makeup made her seem very Bride of Frankenstein with her hair bunned up.
Right, yeah.
But I think overall it's the metaphor that she's not a real person. Fantasies and pornography, they don't show everybody getting their parking validated after they've done the job. You know, they are not presented as human beings with thoughts, feelings.
No. After she's gone, he's so freaked out that he throws up in the sink. He lays down naked on the bed to recoup, and then a very businesslike knock sounds at the door. He rushes and puts on just his raincoat to answer the door, and it's the seaman. He asks if everything went all right, and the narrator's intentionally vague because it wasn't, but he doesn't want to say no. The seaman takes that as a yes and asks for the money right then and there because they have to leave town early in the morning. The narrator pays him.
"Thanks," he said, counting it and putting it into his trousers pocket. I noticed that even his trousers seemed to be seaman's trousers, now that I could see them close to, with him standing just in front of me. "Everything all right then?" "I think so," I said again. I was taking care not to commit myself too far in any direction I could think of. I saw that now he was looking at me, his small eyes deep sunk. At that exact moment, there was a wild shriek from one of the floors below. It was about the loudest human cry I had heard until then, even in one of those lodgings. But the man took no notice. "All right then," he said. For some reason, he hesitated a moment, then held out his hand. I took it. He was very strong, but there was nothing else remarkable about his hand. "We'll meet again," he said. "Don't worry." Then he turned away and pressed the black time switch for the staircase light. I did not stop to watch him go. I was sick and freezing. And so far, despite what he said, our paths have not recrossed.
And that's the end of the story. Remember that throughout that scene, the narrator was dressed like a flasher.
He was. And there's one big question that remains. Did he go back and tell creepo Mr. Edist about his sexcapade?
Did you think of me as you ripped that woman's hand off?
Seriously, that last shriek that the seaman ignored, what was that about?
I was tempted to think it had something to do with Madonna.
Yeah.
Maybe having a delayed reaction of some kind to what had happened to her, but I'm not sure if it's even related. He talked earlier about the noise of these places.
Of course,
Women pounding on the door and saying they've been strangled. One imagines that there's a woman at the door saying, I've been strangled, and he's just lying in his bed, ignoring it, doesn't want to get involved. Maybe that's just a last thought to leave you with. The same thing happened here. It says right away, there was a scream, the loudest he'd ever heard. And the man at the door ignored it, and they continued their conversation. How much do you ignore? I mean, look, there are more people who are watching online pornography than are watching the biggest film releases in the world.
Sure.
Those numbers are much higher. How many people, when they're consuming that, are thinking of the percentage of that is human trafficking?
Right, yeah.
Right? There's a scream in there that you're just not listening to because you're getting what you want. And that's part of that ugliness.
Right.
Of the objectification of women.
Yeah. I think it also might have been about the narrator being a young guy and getting sex confused with intimacy. He's looking for a romantic experience. In all of his descriptions, it's about passion and love. He wants connection. But what he got was just mechanical sex.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's something a lot of people find out the hard way, the difference between those things. Sex and intimacy, they're very complex and can be very confusing, especially if you're somebody that is just inexperienced, which brings us, again, back to that opening in the story. It is to beginners that strange things happen, and often, I think, to beginners only. This was adapted for Tony Scott's The Hunger anthology series. I think it was on Showtime, which was hosted by Terrence Stamp in the first season. The second season, it was David Bowie. It has a very baby-faced Balthazar Getty as an American who's come to London for a business trip. And he runs into these two gay guys that are part of the business that he's with, and they take him to this fetish club where he sees swords being performed. And it's pretty faithful to a point. The actress Amanda Ryan is Madonna, but they call her Musidora instead of Madonna, which I don't know why that choice was made.
Well, because of the pop star Madonna that we're pretending we don't know about. You know, I mean, that's
that?
like, probably why. Don't pretend, because I know you had a relationship with Madonna in the past.
Yeah, that's...
We don't talk about it here.
We don't talk about that here. That was a long time ago.
Well, does the same thing happen in the adaptation?
No. I mean, it does up to a point. Like I was saying, you know, they have a scene, it's in a pub instead of a diner, but the lines are almost directly from the story. And then she comes over and it seems like, oh yeah, this is really sticking to the story, but then they just have sex. Her hand never comes off. Then they have sex a bunch of times. The supernatural element of it is that when they're together, he tries to kiss her and she goes, no, I can't kiss. Showman says that that's not part of the deal. And then she falls in love with him and then they do kiss. But when they get to performing the swords again, the guy actually stabs her with the sword and, you know, blood comes out and she dies.
What?
Yeah, I know. It totally undercuts what is so cool about this story. Like, what is going on with it? It becomes a completely different thing.
Well, also, you know, this short story is really my first experience of sex. So if somebody's hand doesn't come off, I don't want to watch it. That's what I'm into. You know, in that vein, I randomly watched the movie After Hours from the 80s.
Yeah.
Which I had conflated with another movie. I didn't know what it was, but Heather was telling me to watch it. And I swear to God, it's like somebody said, what if we got Robert Aickman to write an 80s sex comedy?
Whoa,
and
really?
they've got Scorsese to direct it. And Scorsese did direct it, but...
What?
Yeah, it's one of his films that I just didn't really watch it ever. And it's
Martin
very surreal and
Scorsese.
strange. Yeah.
Not like
I would like
Stan Scorsese or
not
some other...
Stan Scorsese, not any of those other those many other film director Scorseses. No. Anyway, I thought it was so much like this story or like an Aickman story in general that I'd love to cover it on our extra credit.
I love
this month.
watching movies I don't know anything about and talking about them. So yes, let's do it.
But before we get to that, we are going to be covering The Cicerones by Aickman as well as Bind Your Hair. We have been covering swords, but of course, when you read that title, you might think it says S words. Per the SNL Jeopardy sketches.
Yes.
But I'd like to say some S words right now, starting with our stakers. They make it all
there you
possible. And I'm going to start by thanking the king of all the snakes.
I'd like to thank Cryptographer.
I'd like to thank Alistair Brooks.
Shmail Khan, thank you.
Christopher Rosser, thank you.
It's a ghost. Thank you.
John Morgan, thank you.
I'd like to thank Angelina Brown.
Eric S. Vallone, MD, thank you.
My buddy Richard Wolf, thank you.
And finally, Ben A. And of course, we also have to thank our reader.
Greg Johnson is awesome. Go check out his YouTube videos where he makes cool things. Support him on Patreon.
I'm going to hit you with some final S words.
Strange studies of strange stories.